Welcome back to another episode with myself, Emma from Outside the Bubble, and Marty from Morris Palmer. And today we have the sexy subject of cash flow forecasting. And are you doing it? Are you doing it?
Am I doing? I am actually.
I'm doing it.
Oh, good.
Good.
I do like a bit of cash flow forecasting, and I think it's very, very beneficial and something that not nearly enough of clients are doing. I don't know what you see, but most of my clients
I
aren't.
Completely agree. I was speaking to somebody that was to-ing and fro-ing about whether they needed my help, and we got onto the subject of cash flow forecasting because they were like, "Oh, we never seem to have enough money." And I said, "So, what does your cash flow forecast say?" And they basically said, "Should I tell you our plan?" And I was like, "I'd love to hear your plan because I feel like I'm going to know the answer before you finish speaking." And they're like, "If we have money in the bank, people get paid.
I love that.
If we don't have money in the bank, people do not get paid. It's that simple." And I was like, okay, that's not a forecast.
No.
That's more of a
what you want
plan. We may have to rethink this.
Yeah, I hear that a lot. We've got enough money in the bank.
Yeah.
For now, you have. But it's, as you say, 3 months, 6 months down the line, do you have enough money in the bank then? If things were to take a slight downturn, if you were to lose a big customer, at least if you have a basic cash flow forecast, then you can factor in the worst case scenarios and just see where, what's the worst position that you can get to before you don't have enough money, basically.
Yeah, absolutely.
I had a lady come to me recently from another accountant's, and she was having these quarterly meetings with her accountant. But she said the trouble is all we were doing was looking at the quarterly management accounts. And she said, and I've realised I don't need that. What I need is the next 3 months. How do I make my decisions, decide what I'm spending money on? How do I do all of that without knowing what the next 3 months are? So we said, okay, fine. Well, actually, click of a button, we've got your 3 months management accounts. There's no real work as such to that other than a few accruals, prepayments, things like that. But actually, we'll put time in, instead of doing what they were doing with that, we'll put the time into the cash flow forecast for the next 3 to 6 months, depending. We'll probably start with 3 months and then see if we can actually start forecasting in 6 months. Yeah. Particularly as we get to know the business, because I think it's always quite difficult day one, isn't it? You've got a new client, you don't really know anything about them. All you can base it on is historical figures with maybe a slight inflationary increase or a decrease, whatever they feel. That's all you can really do until you start to understand the quirks, the seasonality sort of changes.
Exactly, the ebbs and flows.
Yeah, exactly. The things that actually affect it. And it takes a little bit of time to build up that knowledge. So I said to her, well, let's start with 3 months. It will undoubtedly be based on historical for now, because that's all I've got to initially produce something. But then we'll have a meeting, we'll talk about it, we'll talk about the business, we'll try and understand what's coming up, where do you see things going in the next 3 to 6 months, any changes, any significant changes that might alter it, and then sort of go from there. And she was like, yes.
Yeah, this is it. I can see daylight now. I absolutely get it.
Yeah, and that's what she really wanted.
Yeah.
Just to know where she is. And I think it's just so important. But probably 80% of my clients don't do that or don't know where they are with it.
I don't think they do. And actually, this is where it comes back to having a good month-end process.
Yeah.
And it comes back to good discipline in closing periods, because essentially, depending on what your payment terms are with your suppliers and your customers, if you already have tight APAR ledgers, the next month, 2 months should be very easy to predict. There shouldn't be anything that happens in those periods that are surprises. And then everything therefore should then be used. This is where I think then going and being curious about what's happening in other departments go. So salespeople, let's have a look at your sales forecast. What do you expect to sell over the next 3 to 6 months? And actually, you can then start building some modelling into your cash flow. So actually, if our salespeople only get 50% of this in, we roughly know this is what our sales will look like. I mean, if you're in a business with recurring revenue, that's so much more helpful and so much easier to plan for. But if you're a project-based customer, do you also have staged payments? There's a lot of project-managed-based companies I go into where actually they pay everything at the end of the project. And it's like, well, how long's a project? And they're like, well, 6-8 months.
Indefinite.
Wow, that's crazy. Let's have a look at that.
Yeah.
So I think when you're thinking about cash flow, it actually brings up some really interesting questions. So if you are a project-based business, do you have stage payments? And if not, should you implement them? Because actually, will that help?
And I can't imagine most people wouldn't expect that anyway. I can't imagine it would, people would resist against it, customers would resist.
No, I don't think so. But I think it comes back down to that. If you as a business have always done something in a certain way, suddenly that change for your customers is more disruptive than I suppose you perceive them to be.
Exactly.
And I think you perceive a lot on behalf of your customers of what they will and won't tolerate.
I think you fear the reaction because you've got to deal with the reaction.
Exactly.
So you sort of fear the worst case reaction, thinking, well, that's what I've got to try and smooth over.
Exactly.
Oh, maybe I won't bother then. It's just easier not to.
I tell you what, we'll just carry on as is. We'll borrow some money. We'll bolster it.
Yeah.
Let's not aggravate anybody.
Yeah, exactly.
So I would say your first 2 to 3 months should be relatively easy to do. I think when you start trying to plan cash at 12 months,
it's hard.
Depending on what your business is, I think it's for the birds a little bit, and it can only be shown as a kind of guidance.
Yeah.
Like almost like a signposted, this is where we'd like to get to.
Yeah. I've got a client, bizarrely, who's got basic 365 payment terms on their supplier invoices. So it's almost essentially a bit like they had a year's loan from the supplier, almost, because they're the sole distributor. And he's very which is good, and I'm pleased he is, but very into cash flow planning. But it's really hard to do, because a year is a huge amount, and he's seasonal as well, which all these factors which make it a lot harder. Whereas, like you say, a couple of months actually is fairly easy. It's that the latter part, isn't it, where it becomes a guesstimate to a certain extent, doesn't it? It's difficult.
And I think it's really hard that when you've got a lot of money in your business, let's just say you've had a first quarter and it's been absolutely dynamite, and you've got all this money, but you're not sure what's going to happen next month. It's what prudency measures are you bringing in? Like how much of that funding are you going to ring fence because you don't know what's going to happen next month? And like I said to people, hope is not something you can run businesses on.
No,
as lovely as it would be, it's just not practical. So I definitely think this is where the accounts department need to get curious about other departments. If you have a procurement department, what have they put POs out for? When do they expect those POs to be delivered? How much are those POs for? Because then you can do some kind of causal plotting. And also have those wider conversations, like how many of these things are we planning on selling this year? And how regularly do we get these deliveries? So even if they are just kind of rough figures, at least there is a plan, and there's a realism about what is likely
because
to
otherwise
happen.
It's all historical based, isn't it? So it's not really any better than just looking at the profit and loss for the last 6 months and saying that's probably likely to happen anyway. So we're just back to that. So like you say, you've got to bring something from the present into it, haven't you? Something real,
something tangible. But also, if whilst you're doing this, if you've got this investment piece, or you're planning on expanding or growing the business, and you're going to use working capital to do that, actually, how much working capital do you have available to you to actually release into this?
Interesting to say about working capital. It's something a lot of my clients, it comes up, and most people don't know what their working capital is. Do you see that with your clients?
I absolutely see that. And and as we were starting to speak about it, I was like, are we going to get into like this technical minefield? So maybe like it would be a really good time for you to explain what working capital actually is.
Well, essentially, I suppose it's the money that you need, the cash that you need to run your business. Lots of different ways of looking at it. I was looking at it yesterday for a client who's actually selling their business, and as part of the deal, they leave the working capital in the company, which is quite common when you sell businesses. So how do you define what that working capital is? Well, one way is essentially the difference between your current assets and your current liabilities. So essentially trade debtors, so the amounts that are owed to you, and then the money that you've got to pay out. So your suppliers, corporation tax, PAYE, all of those. So essentially, how much money would you need to fund those liabilities? Well, your debtors come in, but you still might have a shortfall. How much do you need to plug that gap? But the other thing you've then got to bear in mind is that not all your debtors are going to come in at one point, and you might have a very large VAT bill in the first 5 days, even it could be coming up straight up. So actually, you need a bit more money than just that difference. So one thing I often say to clients, which I think is quite a good way of doing it, is if you look back, say over a 12-month period, what's the minimum amount that your bank balance has dropped to? Because technically that's excess cash. And anything above that is your working capital, because you know that your bank balances go up and down by that amount to fund the business. So with all the calculations, I actually think that's the best way of looking at it, just from actually what do you need to run it, rather than just a calculation. Yeah. What's the movement in your bank? How much can you realistically go up and down by, but still know you've got enough to fund the business? And that's something that a lot of people don't know. So when you go, well, how much excess cash have you got in the business? How much, they might say, how much could I take out? Well, what's your working capital? So you kind of got to work that out to know, okay, what is the excess cash?
What can I use? What is available?
Yeah, what might be there? They might want to buy another commercial premises and use some money in the company as a down payment on that.
Yeah.
But you don't want to use too much, because obviously you might leave yourself in a position where you don't have enough to run the business. So it's quite an important calculation, I think. And understanding that.
And I guess the other thing is, what I'm thinking about at the moment is that in personal finance, everyone is saying, what is a good emergency fund? And I think sometimes for owner managers, it's always like, what is a good emergency fund? How much cash should you have if nothing happened, if you had no sales? How
good
much
idea.
keeps
How many
you
months
safe?
do you... That's normally how you're looking at it, is it? How many months do you need to cover? Like you say, if you had nothing, if something happened to you and the business couldn't continue for a short period of time, 3 months, 6 months, where's that figure for you?
And where's that comfort? And actually, do you even have that? I think that's a great starting question. Like, do you have 3 months of liability payments or cash available to make liability payments right now?
And most people wouldn't leave that buffer in their business.
No.
Most people have already gone below that point, I would say. But I think, 3 months is a really good figure. I think that's a really nice,
it's a
healthy.
It's a healthy figure. It's not so, ridiculously over the top that there's no money not working for the business.
Exactly.
But it keeps it comfortable, because I'm sure you've experienced this, but as soon as a company falls into cash flow problems, that literally engulfs the whole department, and nothing can take their eyes off of the cash flow problem.
It just affects every decision, every thought.
Exactly. And resources just get drawn into it. And then suddenly the company becomes so insular that they can no longer look outwards and look at opportunities, because everything is so constricted. And so what I often say to businesses are, when you're in that situation, you have to remember that if you don't have any opportunity to bring funding in to get yourselves out, you need to understand how you've got in it to get yourself back out. Can you get some temporary funding and make sure that truly is temporary, and that's just not an extension of your cash flow? And then, how do you start building that up? And I think it comes back to that temptation. There's a lot of cash in the bank, and it's just doing nothing, and it's just sat there, tantalisingly doing nothing.
I mean, I think personally that's where different bank accounts come in really useful, isn't it? Pots, I suppose.
Yeah.
Bank accounts do it a different way. But, I like for Maurice Palmer, I've got my VAT on my corporation tax. Those are the only two, admittedly, but you could have more. But I know at least if I've got my VAT covered and my corporation tax covered, it's an estimate because you never quite know, but at least if you're putting away what you think. VAT is a bit easier, but corporation tax, you do have to, I suppose, keep an eye on the profit. And you pretty much probably know where you are. So I put 1/12 of that away each month, and I know I've got a big pot of money there. If I needed a little bit more, it's not the end of the world. If I have a bit too much, great.
Exactly.
So I'd probably rather go that way, being an accountant, a little bit more prudent.
Naturally.
But that's really important, I think, is just almost having pots and saying, that's not my money. That's not my money. That's my buffer. That's the excess.
Exactly.
That's my money.
and I don't think there's any harm in squirreling away money.
No.
I really don't. And actually, I think it's a practice that I don't see in businesses.
No.
Or if it is happening in businesses, they obviously don't need me, which makes sense, which is why I
you're
don't
probably
see
not
it.
seeing those. I do see them, but not loads. But I do see clients where they've got a really good grasp on it.
Yeah.
And generally, that's what they're doing, is they have some sort of pots or something like that they're putting money into for different things. And they understand the importance of that not being theirs. the importance that is actually going to HMRC, or, and we talked about VAT earlier, and essentially, VAT, all you're doing is collecting that money and passing it over to them.
It's not yours.
It's not your money.
Yeah.
I'm always amazed at how many people don't really understand VAT. They sort of think, I've got to pay the VAT. Well, you don't have to pay the VAT. You're just passing the VAT over that you've collected from your customers. So like you say, if you're essentially putting that 20% away, well, you're going to be all right, because you're probably going to have something to deduct from it on your purchases anyway. If you've got your 20% pot in there, amazing. You've got a nice bit to cover your VAT without having to think about it, because it's not your money.
And people really struggle with that.
Really, yeah.
And again, it comes back to that question that if you're struggling to pay your VAT bill, then you are using too much cash.
Exactly.
And I think that comes back down to investment as well. People don't work out what their working capital is. They haven't decided that actually my dividends aren't part of working capital.
Yeah.
And then so actually, if I'm going to invest and I'm going to self-fund, can I self-fund? And something that I don't ever see businesses do, but I do see when it all goes wrong at the other end, which is a board meeting has been held, growth is obviously always on the agenda, and that there's going to be a strategy of how we're going to grow. We're going to do something, we're going to change something, we're going to invest in something. And it's usually around investment, and there's a piece of money that's going to be spent. And it all gets discussed, and the way that they're going to do it and what they're going to get in return. And the thing that still baffles me is that, especially in businesses where they already have a finance director or they have somebody of seniority in the business that understands the finances, they do zero modelling. They never model out the risk of the investment. So if it's a case of, we're going to start selling this new product and actually we should be able to increase turnover by 50%, actually, what happens if you don't? What happens if you make zero sales? Exactly. What happens if you make 15% of those sales that were expected? What is that relationship? And what does that look like? And then what is your risk at board level for that investment? And it's it's a service I offer, and it's something that I try and drum into my clients. Like once I've untangled any pain points in the business, it's right, now you want to grow, that's fine, and now you've got these really big ambitious plans, excellent. I don't want to curb any enthusiasm, but can we map some of this out, please? Can we have a look at, I'm not trying to, and sometimes you feel like a bit of a Dolly Downer, because I don't want to pour cold water on your ideas.
It's just bringing the reality to it.
I just want to make sure you're safe doing it. And actually, what does the margin of safety look like?
And when you do that with people, do you often find that it's not what they thought, or?
Very much so. So sometimes when I think the entrepreneurial mind is very creative, and I know I keep saying this, but I always think of it as, entrepreneurs think in colour. So everything's very vibrant and everything's beautiful and like high resolution colour, and us accountants are like black, white, and a tiny bit of grey, tiny grey. And actually, exactly, how do we, bring those two pieces together? And I think actually sometimes the financial modelling piece is really useful, because when they see their ideas mapped out, and then they can see the different variations of risk. If you do what you're going to say, happy days, go ahead. But if you don't, this is the cause and this is the effect. And actually, do you genuinely think you can do that? Or is that bluster and I'm a great salesperson, or I can make this happen? And there is that energetic enthusiasm. And I know I've spoken to a number of entrepreneurs, and really good ones can create this absolute whirlwind where it's almost like falling in love. They're like, oh my God, this is amazing. This is going to be brilliant. Life is going to be fantastic. But actually, they're the big ideas people. No one's crunched the numbers underneath this. And
it's true. And the salesman, whoever it is, they don't have the same enthusiasm as the entrepreneur quite often, do they? So the reality is, it may not be quite what they think in that sense.
Exactly. And the reality is also, and I'm sure you've come across this, entrepreneurs think every idea they have is the next best thing. And actually you sit there going, people are really going to buy that. Okay. Why would they buy that? Don't trample on my ideas. It's like, I'm not trampling on your ideas. But Yeah, okay. You know, mad things have happened, you know.
Yeah. But it's putting the numbers, it's putting the reality to it, isn't it?
Exactly. And what I generally find is that once we've done a piece of financial modelling for people, then suddenly the appetite doesn't seem to be quite so large. And actually it's like, oh, instead of biting in and, both feet first, let's just dip a toe in and let's do this in a more gradual way and test and see what the market looks like. And although that might feel boring, I think when, your whole life is your business and your business is your life, actually this is probably a really sensitive way of not crashing that all down.
It's funny actually, because it just makes me think of Dragon's Den. I don't know if you've ever watched Dragon's Den, but I'm quite partial to it. I quite like it. And they would say, have you tested the market? Have you done your market research?
Yeah.
And
I've asked my friends.
Yeah, exactly. 10 of my friends said it was a great idea. And you're like, okay, it's not really the market, is it? Okay. But it just makes me think of that, because an entrepreneur is so enthusiastic about their ideas that actually they almost can't see, anything else, can they, basically? No, exactly. And people around them, because they're usually energetic.
Yes.
Exciting, people are like, yeah, it's a great idea. It's a great idea. But thinking, actually, when you go back, you go, would I ever buy that?
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
Why do I want to? Whatever it may be, the reality. But in the moment, you might think you do.
Exactly.
Until you go away.
And then there's having worked in mainly product-led businesses, there are sometimes we've had people come and pitch to us these ideas, and I'm just sat there going, and you've put your own money into this. Like, why?
That's what Peter Jones would say.
But haven't we, what about this? Oh yeah, but that's not as good. Yeah, but, okay, but I really can't see why anyone wants to spend £3 more for something that already exists that's far cheaper.
Yeah. Yes, there's got to be a bit of reality to it, isn't there, I think? I think not just the big ideas.
Yeah.
Exactly that.
And I think that's where, accountants get, that bad rap from, or finance people in general, because they just see it as negativity. And I almost want to say it's not negative. It's not, I don't
You're not saying don't do it.
Exactly. It's just, I want,
be aware of the
let's just have a bit more, let's change the lens from, la la land to reality.
Exactly.
This still might work.
Yeah.
But it might not work in quite the big boom bang way you want it to.
Yeah. And that comes down to that forecast planning, doesn't it? Of actually looking at the numbers and what they're saying rather than what you think, because you've got money in the bank or whatever else is guiding those ideas. You actually have to look at what's it telling you. You actually put the numbers down and,
I think something that it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on this that I see is that when, and actually it makes no sense in my mind, is that when businesses are trying to expand, they're really happy to use their own cash without giving it a second thought, because it's there, it's burning a hole in their pockets. But then the moment you say, well, actually, why don't we just borrow this money and leave the money in the business and, almost carve out this pot so that we can actually track how successful it is, there's almost a reluctance to want to borrow money.
I suppose that's just the risk, isn't it, at that point? It feels riskier to them. That's almost like the reality hitting, isn't it?
But that's almost like the check and balance for me, that if you're not prepared to, borrow money for this idea, why not?
Yeah, because you don't believe in it, you don't have that full confidence in
exactly. So why would you disrupt your working capital and your business that is, generating, a good profit, is allowing you to take dividends and sacrifice that all? Yeah. If this idea is really as good as you think it is and it's really going to produce that next level, then the funding will only be temporary. Yeah. And if you've done your modelling, you should know when your ROI is. So then your borrowing should only have, a finite amount of time. And I always think that's almost a litmus test of, are you prepared to borrow money to support your investment? Yeah. And there almost is I don't want to do that. Okay.
Maybe it's not quite the idea you thought.
Yeah. And I was just wondering if you saw that with clients.
A little bit. I don't know if as much as you do in a way, because I suppose you're in at the business level in a way more than I am probably. So quite often it's almost after the event that they
Yes.
go back to that thing of talking to an accountant. I've done this, rather than, do you think I should do this? Obviously some do, but probably I don't see it as much as you do, to be completely honest. But I do know what you mean in the fact that it becomes something different when it's essentially borrowing it as opposed to just using the money that's in the business, because it's there. I think it just makes it a reality, and actually you have to question the thought process a lot more, don't you, to have to actually go to the bank and borrow some money or whatever you're going to do. Maybe put a business plan with it. Maybe that's the bit that they're not prepared. You know, normally you have to have some sort of business plan or something, don't you?
Or the dreaded PG.
Yeah, exactly.
Do you believe in it enough to put your family home down
Yeah.
as guarantee that this money is safe?
Yeah, exactly that. Yes, very interesting. If a client comes to you and says, Emma, can you help me with cash flow forecasting planning? What's your first step with them?
My first step actually is to go and see how robust their actual accounts are. Because generally, if they've got cash flow forecasting issues, or if they've got cash flow issues, is actually, I want to go and see your debtor days. Because what does that
if you just got money
like?
sat
Do
there
you
that's
have a
not
control in place for that?
Yeah.
And it is surprising that I think it's probably a 50-50 split with companies that do have credit control and those that don't, and those that see no value in credit control. And that, again, that just baffles me slightly.
Yeah, it's all wasted money. It's there.
Exactly. Even in my own tiny business, I have credit control problems. So therefore, the bigger you are, surely the problem is just as scalable.
Yeah.
And then equally, I like to look at the supplier side, and just to make sure, have we got everything in? Is everything fully accounted for? And just to do that piece of, sometimes I like to look at supplier contracts. I actually had a client that was paying their invoices as soon as they came in, and they were like, "We've got no money." It's like, okay. And then I pulled down the aged creditor and the aged debtors report, and I was like, "Well, you've got no creditors."
Loads of debtors.
I was like, why haven't you been putting? And he's like, "Well, we have. We're up to date." And I was like, "Well, you can't be. It's empty." And he was like,
"We paid
them.
them.
We paid them." And I was like, right, well, this is not going to...
That's cash flow.
This is cash flow. This is why we have this problem.
You need your money in to pay.
He goes, but I want happy suppliers. And I was like, happy suppliers are being paid.
I have a lot of clients who do that.
Do you?
Yeah,
I think I'm probably guilty of that.
Yeah, no, I definitely do. I've got a lot who, I know when I invoice certain things, I know what will come straight in and what won't.
Yeah.
And quite a lot of them, they will pay it literally as soon as you invoice it, which I suppose all the while the cash flow is good. It's not an issue, is it? That's the thing. It's only when things take a little downturn that you have to then look at, well, hang on a minute, maybe I need to take advantage of those credit supplier terms so, I can get some money in to actually pay it. But it is that age-old thing. Well, it's good, it doesn't matter.
Exactly. And I think that is like the theme, isn't it? That if it's good, it doesn't matter. But then when it's bad, what are we going to do about that? And the one thing I would say in my experience is that when you've identified a cash flow issue, and if you're in a negative cash flow territory, whatever changes you make in the next 2 weeks aren't actually going to flow through for another 6 to 8.
Yeah.
So there are sometimes I get quite impatient entrepreneurs that will be like, but we've made all these changes and nothing's changed. Yeah. It's like, yes, but it has to flow through the system. And actually some of these are baked in problems, and you might not actually see the upside for another 3 months.
Yeah.
And it's almost like, but we stopped doing it.
Yeah,
like,
we did it when you said.
Exactly, we did everything you said.
Yeah.
And it will filter through.
Yeah.
What are your top tips for when clients realise they're in that negative cash flow territory? They may not have funding, they might not have, an overdraft facility or a borrowings facility. There's quite a lot of small businesses don't.
No, exactly.
And I always think that a piece of advice for SMEs is, always have some form of borrowing in place before it gets bad.
Yeah, it's a good idea because it's easier to extend it than to get something new in that
exactly place. And even if it may cost you a little bit and you don't utilise it, it might feel like wasted money. Yeah. because when you do need it,
Yeah.
my experience of banks are very reluctant to
I
then
think
go,
it's really good advice, actually. Yeah.
have some cash.
Yeah,
You've got
true.
a negative cash flow.
It's
you don't
true.
know why.
Yeah.
Now we're going to lend to
Now
you.
we'll give you some, it's fine. Yeah, very good advice, actually. If you've got something there, it's a lot easier to expand on that than to go and get something new, I suppose.
Yeah.
But then, like you say, I think, you have to look at your debtors and your creditors and see what's going on with those, because a lot of the time there can just be some big debts that haven't come in, that aren't being chased in. No one even has thought about them. So I suppose it's the simple things first, because getting money in the door is crucial. And maybe looking at your credit terms that you're offering. A lot of people do 30 days. But do you need to drop to 14 days? By dropping to 2 weeks, are your customers going to mind? Probably not really. There'll be some that just don't do it anyway.
Yeah.
But there'll obviously be some that will go in line with it. And even something as simple as that, just shortening those credit terms, can make quite a big difference to cash flow. So again, I suppose, as it is with all things, just look at the simple things first. What can you change really, really quickly?
Yeah.
We talked about it before, but are you just spending out on things you don't need to be spending out on? Stop all of those.
Yeah.
Wasted things anyway. Stop all of those. Call all your money in that that's overdue, that can come in. Look at shortening those terms, and look at using your supplier credit terms if you're not using them.
Yeah.
And then I suppose you've got to see, what have you got to plug? Does it need some funding, some short-term funding, or is that actually just going to make the problem? Are you at a point actually?
Are you exacerbating it then?
Yeah, exactly. I think that's the crucial thing, is actually identifying whether it's fixable or whether, are you insolvent?
Yes.
Is there actually no way back from this? Have we just been trying to get to a point where we now have to look at it and go, this isn't working?
Yeah, we have to call this a day.
We have to call this a day. And it's really, really hard to do that, because you always believe it's going to get better. Well, most people do. And it can be really hard to identify the point where it's not.
Yeah.
Because you feel like you failed at that point. So most people don't want to acknowledge that. I think sometimes we have to help people acknowledge that.
Exactly, or at least, plant the seed.
Yeah, exactly.
Something we haven't spoken about, which is very relevant to this conversation, is actually the dividend holiday.
Yeah.
Because I think people, if you look at a P&L, your dividend is not going to appear on that. Even though, as a sidebar, I see a lot of people that count their dividends as a cost. It's just like, no, this is not right.
And I think, unfortunately, when they're setting up their chart of accounts and whatever it may be, they just put expense in there.
Yeah.
And of course, then it's falling into their costs in their chosen software.
Yeah.
So it's I always put it to equity.
Yes.
As a little thing. I don't know if that's right.
I do.
And therefore, at least you're not, when you're running your profit and loss, it's not being distorted by dividends.
Exactly. Because there are a lot of times where I look at it and they go, we're making a loss. And I'm like, well, actually, no, if we take your dividends out, you're actually making a profit, but actually your dividends are the thing that is tipping you over.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
So I think that's one of those things that, it might be unpopular, but taking down and ridding yourself, or even taking a partial holiday, just until that cash has come back in and built back up, and then restart.
Sometimes it has to be done.
Exactly. Sometimes there is a sacrifice that has to be made.
And as a business owner, you just have to do it.
Yeah. And if you love your company, that is the ultimate sacrifice.
Exactly. Well said, Emma.
Thank you. So with that said, I think we've delved rightly and deeply into cash flow.
We have.
If you've been watching this and thinking, my cash flow doesn't feel nice, it's feeling a bit tight, please feel free to reach out to Marty and I, and we would love to get stuck in and hopefully make you cash positive. So thank you for watching.
Thank you.